presentation tonight is by Dave Farnham, who is the president of the Falmouth Historical Society. He has a great disclaimer on his talk tonight, but I won't infringe on it. I'll let him give that. But he has served on the board since 2015 and president since 2017. Is that right?
Yeah, term limited out in October.
No, you are a brave, brave man. He enjoys researching family and property histories, and he says living in Falmouth means you can't kick over a stone without finding a story beneath it. And that's so true. Okay. All right, so David, it is all yours.
Thank you. Do we have any Wabanaki in the room? Seriously, are there any Wabanaki or any people from Eastern Algonquian tribes? Okay. If there had been, I would have asked them to come up here, sit next to you and kick me when I said something wrong. I'm one of the amateur history detectives at Falmouth Historical. Our research area covers present-day Falmouth. It also covers, the area that was ancient Falmouth, when that town was chartered in October of 1658, and up until the point where various towns, for reasons that only they understand, decided to divorce us. Starting with the town of Cape Elizabeth, which at the time included South Portland, in November of 1765. So from 1658 to 1765, we were part of the same town. Your history is our history for 107 years. So like the other 143, I'm counting both of us, so there's 145. So the other 143 town historical societies in Maine, our job is telling the stories of our town. Most of these stories are uplifting. We tell the tales typically of townspeople who rose to overcome some really big obstacles and shape the communities in which we now live. Tonight, we have a very dark tale with a very unhappy ending. It's a story of Native people who farmed, fished, hunted, and thrived here until the beginning of the 17th century, when they were crushed by attacks, famine, disease, and then ultimately encroachment. Some fled west and assimilated into other Native people, tribes, and bands. Most perished. During a span of 7 decades, a vibrant community vanished into the mists of time. Got to begin with the vocabulary. This talk is about people who spoke various Eastern Algonquian dialects. I don't speak any one of them. So I will use the current common English place names and not embarrass myself or disrespect the Wabanaki by trying to pronounce the names they use for these places. Some of them are actually, the names are actually French or English transliterations that are so awful that linguists are unable to figure out actually what the word originally was. So again, got to keep it simple. When you say Wabanaki today, we typically mean the Wabanaki Confederation, which consists of the tribes you see listed up there. I'm going to use a broader meaning of the word, which goes back before the Confederation was formed in the mid 18th century, and that sweeps in people who were no longer there when the Wabanaki Confederation was founded. As you'll hear tonight, we have solid historical evidence of Wabanaki habitation in Falmouth, and that of course includes the Cape, before and during the English settlement in the 17th century. This map is out of our town's comprehensive plan, but it's based on information provided by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, I believe, on archaeological sites throughout the town. And there's a record of habitation by Native people going back 14 millennia. So this presentation describes Wabanaki history and culture and how it was obscured by cultural ignorance, and bias on the part of Western European observers and researchers, many of whom lacked the skills and knowledge to present and accurately give a credible account. Before you tonight, you're going to view a presentation prepared by an amateur historian of Western European ancestry and culture who is lacking in the requisite skills and knowledge. And in assembling this narrative, I can only say that I am standing on the shoulders of people who are much, much more capable historians. And this brings us back to the challenge for town historical societies, many of them particularly in southern and western Maine. The Wabanaki are the first chapter in our town's history. Wabanaki history is based mostly on oral traditions, stories passed down generation to generation. When the people who know those stories die out without having transmitted them, because there was nobody to transmit them to, the stories die with them. Our job as in a historical society is to reconstruct the narrative for people who have vanished. You know, thanks to hard work on the part of a lot of people, we now have enough threads that we've been able to weave together the basic story for the Wabanaki who lived here 4 centuries ago. My job this evening is to faithfully recount what we've discovered. It was only a few years ago that we discovered that, well, we knew we had Native people here, but it was only a few years ago that we discovered that these people had been called by some the Aucosisco. Previously, our knowledge had been based on what we learned at school or what we read in reputable history books. Alas, they got the story wrong. Histories are often based on contemporary accounts by explorers and settlers, and were written by Western Europeans describing an alien culture. If you walk out into the parking lot and a Klingon star cruiser is out there waiting, snatches you in, and carries you off to Klingon, or whatever planet they have, and then brings you back and drops, you are going to have a hard time giving us a true representation of Klingon culture, since I don't think many of us in this room can even speak Klingon. This is what we encounter when we start looking at some of the original source material. It's compounded because a lot of histories were published in the 19th century, we still depend upon, and they were written by white dudes. The ones that really get you, the ones that were sitting in Washington, who had never set foot in Maine and never seen a Wabanaki, let alone spoken to one. So descriptions of Wabanaki culture were often force-fitted into the generally accepted models of Western civilization. Hint, their civilization was every bit as sophisticated and complicated as ours, but it was different. And a lot of this got lost in the process of making it acceptable for Western ears. Even worse, parts that couldn't be force-fitted were often buried because of concerns that they would upset authorities in government, the church, or the aristocracy. How many of you remember seeing the Press Herald series? It was their bicentennial series. It led off with an article on Dawnland. It was 2020 as part of the bicentennial thing. Really, really first-rate series. And the author it was Colin Woodard. My wife and I are big fans of Colin Woodard. He is, and we are really impressed with the quality of the research, his historical research he's done for some of his books. I mean, there's one that if I had to teach a course in U.S. history, I'd use this book because I think it's got the best description of America that I've ever seen. The article included this map right here. And if you look at the map, and where we are here, this is Casco Bay, it shows that the native people living here were the Pigwackets. This is partially true. The Pigwackets, or sometimes referred to as the Pequawkets, were located to the west of Casco Bay, just a little bit farther west than this would lead you to believe. The map was based on the what were considered authoritative sources on native peoples in New England. But if you went digging through some of those authoritative sources, and there's one in particular that I'm highlighting here, one of the foundational reference works was a, I think, 18-volume series called Handbook of North American Indians, published in 1998. In volume 15, which covered most of the native people of Maine, there was a chart showing the tribal areas for the eastern Abenaki. And if you look way down in the corner, right over here, you'll see these little dots, and right beside them is the word Aucosisco. No explanation in the text. They simply said, there was something here called Aucosisco, and we don't know what it was. So there were hints out there, sort of guide us a bit. So if the foundational references were wrong, how do we find the truth? There were a lot of places for us to look. We had contemporary accounts from the 17th century, plus there were documents, legal documents that were filed in the 17th century, which included references to native people. A great deal of information about Wabanaki culture can be found at some of the tribal sites and some of the cultural museums. And there's a growing body of material from both historical research and archaeological work. The trouble is there's so much information scattered in so darned many places. It helps if you have an expert to guide you. So our town celebrated its tercentennial. That was the 300th anniversary of our re-chartering after the French burned the town to the ground twice. And one of our volunteers took charge of updating our town history. And we were fortunate, she just so happened to be a professional historian, complete with a PhD. She took a gimlet-eyed view of everything. How credible is the source? Is there contrary information? she had the skills that a professional historian has to separate fact from fancy. And just as important, she knew how to find stuff in places that we never would have thought to look. In particular, she turned up papers by a history professor at Salem State University. And as we cast our net farther afield, we learned that when you're looking for information about the Wabanaki along Maine's southern coast, all roads lead to Professor Emerson Baker, who is currently sitting probably warm and snug in his 1792 house in, down in York. He left no stone unturned, partially because he's an historical archaeologist and turned over a lot of stones in the course of his research. He also turned up a treasure trove of information in treaties and deeds that turned out in some cases to be first-person accounts by Wabanaki. This presentation is mostly based on his research. He put it all together, and Professor Baker, please forgive me if I garble what you wrote. Anyone who watched television westerns in the 1960s came away convinced that the native people of North America were a bunch of ignorant savages. The English people who settled here very quickly learned that the situation was far from the truth. The Wabanaki knew more about the English because they had been dealing with English, particularly English fishermen and other people for decades than the Europeans knew about the Wabanaki. The Wabanaki actually thought that the European culture was just plain nuts, and I think they still do, but they also knew how to play the game. So when they were conveying property to the English, they would show up en masse. There would be members of the band to attest that the sachem had the authority to convey the property. If it was anywhere near a border with other bands, they'd have people from that band there to attest that yes, it was proper for this band to convey that. This is not a bunch of hicks from the sticks selling their selling Manhattan for a bag of beads. These people were sharp and they knew what they were doing. And fortunately, a good deal of this got caught and captured in records. I think the poor people who must have had, they'd get up there and say, my name is so and so. I am the sachem of such and such of this group, and then start rattling off the people because family relationships. They had social relations, all this stuff would get spelled out. The poor people who had to transcribe this must have had to bring a box of quill pens just for every deed. The late Professor Geer focused on the Pigwackets, and one of his papers was a big help for us in sorting out some of the confusion between the independent band down in Saco, the Chuacoit, with the lower Saco band of the Pigwackets. You start reading the histories and things got convoluted fairly quickly. He helped us untangle it. So European fishermen had been coming to the Gulf of Maine since the 16th century. This ramped up in the early 1600s, particularly with fishermen from Bristol, England, which is why it should be no surprise that you look at the names of the people who were living out here, and a number of them came from Somersetshire, which is where Bristol was located. That's how they learned that this was a good place to go. For some guy named Gorges, Ferdinando Gorges, was from Somersetshire. The fishermen, however, spent most of their time out on offshore islands. Monhegan was one of their favorites. So they don't have as much to offer in terms of solid information about the native people, particularly along the southern coast. We get the first mother lode, if you will, from Samuel de Champlain's accounts of explorations of the Maine coast in 1605 and 1606. And he and Marc Lescarbot took extensive notes on the people, and they divided the native people they met along here, along the coast of Maine, into the Amushaquaa, which were on the coast from really the Kennebec River all the way down to Nahant in north of Boston on the North Shore. The Etchemin, which we know now includes the Eastern Abenaki, the Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy. And then the Suraquaa, which were the Micmac, located up on Nova Scotia. He made a big distinction between the Eastern Abenaki and the coastal bands to the south. And then they assigned names to each of the bands as they passed through. The names appear to be based on whatever Wabanaki word described the area where they had encountered these people. Well, Aucosisco is believed to be the name of Bat Cove in Portland. And you can sort of envision it. They've got somebody who speaks local language. They're translator. They're on the boat. They're sitting in what's now Portland Harbor, talking to this native person, and they're asked, what do you call this place? He points over. Native person looks over. Oh, Bat Cove, Aucosisco, and that's how they got their name. Sometimes it's also referred to as Amushaquaa, the collection of these bands. There are those who believe that it is an Eastern Wabanaki word meaning dog people or little dog people, particularly for the Micmacs, and which speaks volumes about how there were troubles between the Amushaquaa and Micmacs later on. John Smith made a trip here, just noted that this is of Pocahontas fame, and noted the presence of the Aucosisco Nation. Christopher Levitt was sent over here to set up plantations here just a couple of years, but he developed very close relations with the Aucosisco, treated them very well. They were disappointed to see him leave, but he shed some light onto where and how they lived. So, zooming out, looking at the Amushaquaa, Professor Baker's seminal paper, which was in 2004, Finding the Amushaquaa, includes a 6-sentence paragraph that contains all the key points about them. Their territory extended from the Kennebec all the way down to Nahant. These were independent bands, not part of any tribe. There were family connections, however, between the various bands. Here's the key part. They were sedentary horticulturists. Now, how many of you heard the story, and this is what we taught, is the reason there were people on the coast is those were actually the inland tribes coming down to the coast in summertime. I'm not going to say that's wrong, but there were already people on the coast, and they were stuck on the coast because they were farmers. Their farms were fixed. They had to be there pretty much year-round because this was the source of their wealth, and they were actually pretty prosperous. You look at the Western model; they were farmers as opposed to hunter-gatherers. The reason it sort of stopped up here is the climate really north of Brunswick is not suitable for cultivation of a lot of the crops that they had. Another fun fact, and from my readings, this is actually true of a lot of native cultures throughout North America, is that women held positions of power. In the Amishakwa, women could be the sachems, could be the chiefs. They could sign deeds. They could do things, many things that in certainly in the European culture, women rarely did. Moreover, when a man married, he would go join his wife's band or family. They were at least matrifocal, if not matrilocal, if they were not matrifocal. Samuel Champlain got it right after all. By the mid-17th, so why did they disregard him? By the mid-17th century, many Amishakwa had been annihilated. Champlain's accounts didn't match what the settlers were seeing on the ground. Moreover, if you actually go out and look at what some of Champlain's writings, there is some really goofy stuff in there. So you just see people shaking their heads and saying, this guy doesn't, he was making this stuff up. It's easy to see why they ignored it. Let's zoom in and talk about native people who lived here. Aucosisco territory stretched from Small Point down to Scarborough. Exactly where in Scarborough, I'm not sure. There was the next band to the south was the Chillicothe, based out of Saco, and I wouldn't be surprised to find that it was the Blue Point, Black Point, the river there was the dividing point, but we don't know that. We do know that they had a presence down there. Their village was on the south side of the Presumpscot River at the lower falls. Today we call that Presumpscot Falls. Their planting grounds were out by Cumberland Falls. I believe it was on this side of the Presumpscot River, very close to where S.D. Warren or Sappy is located. But that's the next falls up, so if they were transporting goods by water, they had fairly clear canoeing, I guess, between their village and their planting grounds. They grew what's referred to as the native trilogy of corns, beans, and squash. And later settlers took over, English settlers took over the planting grounds. Evidence of Aucosisco fondness for seafood can be found in shell middens. I know specifically of some on Mackworth Island, as well as some on Great Diamond Island.
There's some here in Cape Elizabeth.
Yeah, they're everywhere. Where there were clams, there were going to be shell middens. They were particularly fond of cod, clams. In terms of hunting, both ducks and deer were popular. Older adults who grew up in Falmouth recall finding arrowheads and other artifacts along what we now call Skiddery Gusset Creek. We now know that the native name for that was Skikowe, or Skikowe, I'm guessing of the pronunciation. Leadership appears to have been hereditary, and again may have allowed women to be chiefs. So all is well with these happy people living the good life where we live today. It didn't last. The so-called Tarratine Wars began in 1606 with the death of, I believe this is Penaniac. It was the son-in-law of the Micmac Saknau, who was the grand chief. And things get really muddy here. I find multiple accounts, and I think this is more confusion on the part of the English historians who got befuddled by all these tribes that seemed to have names that were kind of alike. So, some accounts say it was the Passamaquoddy. The chief retaliated by attacking the next year with a devastating attack on the Chilcoot down in Saco. Martian, who was the sachem of the Aucosisco, was killed during that attack. Begging questions about the identity of the various antagonists. What we do know is the Micmac attacked Saco. A bunch of people died, including two sachems, two chiefs. Micmacs had a big advantage both in size and technology. The French had located their principal base up there at Port Royal. And because of this, because of the proximity, the Micmacs were getting access to French firearms, and this came as a big surprise to me, sailing vessels. They started out with shallops and then graduated to ketches and sloops, and were even known to have schooners, which came as a big surprise half a century later during the, I believe it was during Queen Anne's War, when some Micmac sailed into a Maine coastal village in a schooner, grabbed all of the vessels in the village, and skedaddled. This is not the way you see it done in the westerns. Our native people were smarter and cleverer. But anyhow, the war went on. It got really nasty. The Penobscot leadership, including the sachem and his entire family, was killed in 1615. The war then expanded down into Massachusetts, where the sachem of the Naumkeag, which was the southernmost band, was killed in 1619. But by going that far south, the Micmac had exposed them to the virgin soil epidemics. They brought the germs back, and that brought the war to a pretty swift end, although the raids on the Amishiqua, specifically on the Aucosisco, continued all the way up into 1631. My white Western European perspective on this is the Micmac were hunter-gatherers. The folks down here were agrarian. How much do you want to bet every time the weather started to turn cold, they started looking on that nice fat farm down here as their local IGA? They've got the vessels, they sail down, they've got the weapons, they take what they want, kill anybody that gets in their way, and they skedaddle back. That's my vision. There's absolutely no historical fact to back that up, but I can see why the Amishiqua, the agrarian Amishiqua, were getting hammered so much and for so long by the Micmacs. The Amishiqua had been crippled by the widespread death and destruction, and this, of course, first from the war, and then from what they call the Great Dying, and that comes next, and that result from the war first, and that resulted in famine. Next came the Great Dying. We had a historian come and talk to us, and he said that the virgin soil epidemics are overstated in terms of their effect. And that may be true for large inland tribes. For the Amishiqua and other bands that were located along the coast and very exposed to the English, the epidemic was devastating. Researchers have not identified which disease caused the wholesale deaths among the coastal Wabanaki. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention now believes it was leptospirosis, which is not particularly fatal now, but when it comes out of the blue, it apparently could have had devastating effects. I'll give you the English perspective of the Great Dying. Within these late years, there hath, by God's visitation, reigned a wonderful plague, the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory, so as there is not left any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein. We, in our judgment, are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time has come in which Almighty God, in his great goodness and bounty towards us and our people, hath thought it fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such of our subjects, James, by grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, and defender of their faith. Not a lot of love there, is there? After this double whammy, there were not a lot of Aucosisco remaining, and now they had to contend with a flood of English settlers. Here, the picture up at top right is a Micmac, and he probably doesn't look very much different than any of the Amish-Aqua. The Aucosisco were believed to wear their hair, style their hair a little bit differently. I think the men would shave off this part of it and then tie it up behind. The center one shows a coastal village afflicted by the Great Dying, and the last illustration shows the construction of the first home at Old Casco, which we all know to be the old port, now the Old Port in Portland. Some Amish-Aqua were wiped out by the trifecta of war, famine, and disease. Those that survived had been severely reduced. Oh, sorry, you take pictures. These are all online.
Okay.
So you can download them along with my speakers notes. Oh, anyway, get that. Yeah. By 1620, after the Great Dying, there appeared to have been enough Aucosisco remaining here in Falmouth to produce food. Unfortunately, the continuing Micmac raids whittled away at those numbers, and by the end, only a handful of Aucosisco remained. Probably, I'm not going to try and pronounce her name, and what remained of she was the Sachem, and what remained of her family. Following her death, the family was reduced to trading land for provisions. This is a copy of one of the deeds. This is one where Skiddery Gusset, who by that time had become the Sachem, had conveyed a boatload of land up in what looks like from Capissic up into Westbrook to, who did he give it to? To Francis Small, who had to annually give him one trading coat and 1 gallon of liquor. You know, they were literally trading their land for provisions. The last such deed that we saw was dated 1672, and I think there was maybe just 1 or 2 people left then. So there may have been no Aucosisco remaining at Falmouth when the uprising of King Philip's War arrived in the autumn of 1675. The first chapter of our town's history was a tragedy born of calamity. European settlers share some complicity in this. I love to throw bricks at the French. The French commercial interest disrupted traditional patterns for sustenance and trade among the eastern Wabanaki, and that set the stage for trouble. They then lit the fuse by giving the Micmac military mobility advantages that I think made it feasible for them to commence hostilities in what became the Tarleton Wars. And then English settlement and commercial activity along the coast of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont that brought the virgin soil epidemics. Conservative estimates for deaths to war, famine, and disease range between 2/3 and 3/4. And for the Aucosisco, that was probably more. Such horrible casualty rates probably caused some of the Aucosisco to flee west, either to Abenaki tribes in New Hampshire or even in Vermont. More likely, they headed north and west up to the St. Francis River, northeast of Montreal, where they would have been assimilated into new groups. So if there are any, the most likely place to find anybody, if we had DNA, the closest match would probably come out of those Abenaki communities that are now what's referred to as, I believe it's Odanak, O-D-A-N-A-K. So from 1605 to 1675, a proud band and vibrant community of more than 1,000 Wabanaki disappeared in the midst of time, leaving a handful of artifacts, some stories, and that was it. At least they were spared what came during the next half century when death and destruction was visited on Falmouth. So this is what we town historical societies in Maine do. Usually with happier stories than this one. We share the history of our town by telling its stories, one story at a time. And with 4 centuries of recorded history, we've got plenty of stories to tell. So what questions do you have?
Just this last slide, so are you interchanging Wabanaki with Aucosisco? Is that the population of the whole Casco Bay?
No, the Wabanaki was, sorry, that was the Aucosisco. It was about 1,000. There were 240 men, warriors. So that would have, typical family sizes, that would have extrapolated to probably a little on the high side of 1,000 people. That date was, I think, from Levitt.
So at some point, I heard that the Massachusetts colony asked the Maine people to have the local indigenous people turn in their guns.
Yes.
And that this caused a famine, an acute problem with the remaining Indians.
So that particular incident occurred right after this. So keep in mind, this was a total, what we're describing here, was an internecine war involving the Wabanaki. Only indirectly did the European powers have anything to do with it. Sort of the surprise is it was not all kumbaya among. I'm going to use the word we're not supposed to use, Indians. They got into conflicts, and as we saw here, they could get really. This was a bloodbath, the Terror King War. That was over by around 1620. Things had quieted down by around 1630. We then at about the same time in the 1630s we had the English settlers flooding into Maine. They had already been in Massachusetts for a little while, and some people treated them well, and some people treated them very badly. It came to a head in 1675 when there was a Native People uprising, which we now call King Philip's War. For information about that, we gave a presentation of that at our annual meeting. You can go check the slides on that. But that lasted about 2.5 years. Things settled down. But during that, there was concern about, and I'll refer to them as the Androscoggin, of the larger tribes up here. They were a little bit closer and they were a little more vocal than some of the others. And they sent a delegation up to the Androscoggin. I believe it was the Androscoggin, I may be wrong, to the Androscoggin and asked them to turn over their weapons, which they needed for survival. They were hunter-gatherers, and why go back to they needed the weapons for safety. They didn't want to turn their weapons, and things started to get ugly about that. And there were some. It is believed that in the at least Maine was a sideshow during King Philip's War. You read the history books, and most of them don't even mention Maine. Well, technically Maine did exist, but they don't mention the activity that went on here. We had two brief spats, but the one in 1675, where they had not identified who was actually in the raiding party. There are two stories. One were disaffected people from the disaffected members of the Androscoggin band who came down here to raise, or just angry and came down here to raise hell. They may have done that in cahoots with some from another, from some Massachusetts tribes. There was also a gentleman by the name of Squando who had a axe to grind, and he had just cause for being very, very angry at the English. Some of them had caused his son to die while they were just fooling around. His infant son was drowned, and so he was very angry. And so there's some accounts that believe that Squando was involved. There's a good chance he was, but who provided the firepower for the raid? It was the November 1675 raid that sort of started with the massacre, the weekly massacre on the Presumpscot. A lot of information, no facts. The historians have been trying to figure this one out for 300 years and haven't gotten very far. But one of the precipitating incidents was that story that you mentioned. I'm sorry, it's a long-winded and convoluted answer, but that was just part of the fabric of things that sort of led to this explosion we had, brief explosion of violence we had here in Falmouth. And it really stretched from Spurwink all the way up to the Presumpscot during the first raids. And then it came back and lasted longer in the summer of the following year. And then the following spring, there was a peace treaty and things had settled down. But a lot of people skedaddle south. That was nothing compared to the violence that we had in 1690 in King William's War, which was the French. There was some guy named Louis who lived in a big fancy house in some place called Versailles, who didn't like the fact that there were people from New England, and I'm sure he spat whenever he said that, encroaching upon Nouvelle-France, or the fact that there were Protestant heretics, probably spat when he said that too, encroaching upon good Catholic soil, and he told his governor, clean them out from upstate New York all the way over. And the way they did it would have made ISIL green with envy. Portland was destroyed, except for the handful captured, or those who would have the good sense to flee at the first sign of trouble. The inhabitants of Falmouth were massacred. The place, everything was burned to the ground. It was a scorched earth. They wanted to terrify the English. They did. The English didn't return for about a decade. They didn't return to the Portland Peninsula for a quarter of a century. Deja vu all over again. These were all North American theaters of what were religious wars, Catholic versus Protestant wars in Europe. That one got settled, things got settled here. It re-erupted in Europe, it re-erupted here. And the second time around, the folks over here in Cape Elizabeth, they took it hard because they couldn't get to safety in time. The fort had been moved up to what's now the country, near the country club in Falmouth. People in there were spared and were eventually rescued, but everything else in the town was destroyed. That's why in 1718 they had to recharter the town. It had been literally wiped off the face of the map twice by the French. So that's the big, when you look at our history, those were the big events for that period. It was a horrible, that part of our history is very dark, very violent, and very bloody. I mean, you can sit there and say, Falmouth, did you know there was a battle in your backyard? Somebody lives on the flats, Here in Cape, a good place not to have been living was over near Spring Point, Paputic. They weren't able to get across the river in time, and the families, and the names of those families are names which are still here in Cape. They're familiar names to all of you. There's probably some of you with those names in this room. Unfortunately, I can't remember them off the top of my head. Go read Willis, he's got them all. But the poor folks over at Spring Point, anytime the French showed up with their native allies, knickknacks from sometimes, they were massacred. Boy, you're really getting me on this. Of all we got all kinds of nice stuff that happened in our history. Now we're really raking up all the blood and guts.
So here, later on,
I jokingly tell people that we've got some stories that if you turn me loose at a Boy Scout campfire, there's going to be a bunch of sleeping bags having to hang from the cords the next day to dry out.
I had a couple questions. Number one, so you don't believe it's true that the Indians wintered inland and took the rivers down for the summer?
Now, I'm sure some of that happened. For example, the Bajepscots, I think, were a little more mobile, but I think they had used that model for explaining away why there were all these settlements along these communities along the coast. There were permanent, and the key phrase in there that they used was sedentary horticulturists. I actually had to look that up. Basically, it's fixed location farming, and it's because of that they were there, and they were at the lower falls, so it was just a short canoe ride down to the Presumpscot Estuary, Mackworth. When the stories, it sounds like Mackworth was just one giant shellman when Mayor Baxter took it over. So yes, there may have been that migration, but I think that tended to, some historians used that to obscure the fact that there had also been permanent settlements along the coast.
There's always been this legend, I think you alluded to a chief's son drowning, but there was the curse of the Saco River, that every year a white man will die because supposedly a white man threw the baby into the Saco and the chief's son and died.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to that legend, do you think?
That's Squando's son.
Oh, that's not Squanto of the Pilgrim.
Squando, no, it's Squando's, Squando. And he's not a complicated figure. He sort of played both sides of it. He would sort of be a go-between, a sympathetic go-between, and then he would turn around and do some really nasty stuff. Very hard, well, of course I'm looking at him through Western European eyes. But he was a very complicated person. It was his son, his wife was out. Apparently there were a couple of mariners there who had heard, at least this is a story, the source for this I got is from Willis, but it's also other places, sorry, Willis, the History of Portland. It's also, the same account is found elsewhere, is, I suspect alcohol was involved. Walking along, they had heard that Indian children could swim from birth, that they had a native ability to do this. So they decided to find out. They take this child away from the woman, an infant, throw him into the water, and he heads to the bottom. She dives in, pulls him out, but it's too late, and he dies. And if you were his dad, I think you'd be pretty darn ticked off about that, and which would explain some of Squando's behavior.
The last question is, Massacre Pond, over there in Scarborough, Prout's Neck. There were Libby's involved there. Were they Micmac, or had the Aucosisco, had they already been wiped out by the Micmac by then? Do you know which Indians were part of that?
So give me a date.
I think it was during the French-Indian War, so it'll be about 1670 to 80.
Short answer is I don't know. Second answer is go ask Scarborough Historical. They do. To begin with, the Aucosisco were ancient history by then. As for who, as I recall, most of the incidents that happened towards the end involved Eastern Abenaki tribes, some of which had got pretty well wiped out. The Androscoggin and the Kennebec are pretty much gone. There may be fragments, I don't know, because they're that way. But I saw one reference where it simply referred to clams and cod as being a big part of their diet. That comes from an archaeologist, so I would imagine that there had been archaeological evidence to support that. I don't recall having seen it in any of the local accounts.
And my other question was about the beaver pelts. Was that a big issue, or that was long after the...
No, it was actually one of the precipitating events for the Tarratine War. I don't know how beaver pelts played out down here, but it was a big deal further up the coast. And it was a big, super big deal when we started dealing with some of the Eastern Wabanaki, the Micmac, the Maliseet, probably the Penobscots. You get up there and there was a huge volume of trading involving pelts, with the fishermen who would then take it back. Some of this is going all the way back into the 1500s. There was, I was sort of surprised when we were doing some research on one family to learn that there had actually been a short-lived, year-round trading post, I believe, at Pemaquid. And out in Monhegan, that wasn't a big surprise, but there was a lot more mobility by the native people, than more venturing out onto blue water than I think we give them credit for.
I have a good question. Did all the bands from north to south and east to west pretty much share the same language?
They all spoke dialects of Eastern Algonquian, but that Eastern Algonquian was spoken all the way down to Virginia. But those in the Wabanaki spoke forms that were closer than others. You saw there were some differences between Eastern Abenaki and the Western Abenaki. There are linguists that actually have got charts that will compare. For example, the Maliseet and the Micmac dialects were very, very close. Penobscots, close, but not quite as close. Distance simply became a factor in there, but you would be understood. But it was interesting as we put this together, we turned to a reference on place names, Indian place names along the coast, and so these are linguists who specialize in these, and some of the ones in our area, they comment, oh, by the way, the structure of this name makes it a Micmac dialect. I wonder how I picked that up, but so yes, mutually intelligible, but they could tell you that you're not one of us. They'll joke about somebody from Savannah trying to talk to somebody from Rockland.
It almost seems when you mention the Micmac in schooners and boats, raiding villages down in Saco or I guess Casco Bay, it almost sounds like the Vikings or something.
They got it from the French. Because first of all, Okay, now this is from memory. So the first to come were the Portuguese, but they were sort of supplanted by, now this is up more around Newfoundland. They were supplanted by the Basques, who were, much to my surprise, serious shipbuilders and seafarers. And then, you know, the Spanish sort of got in there but fell out of the French. The French really became a major player, and then the English were actually a little later in the game. But they so they had major fishing, European fishing, up, you know, Newfoundland, based mostly out of Newfoundland, but that whole area around 1530, and it continued to advance. It started, I think, to shift a little farther to the south by around 1560. Again, the English were over here, that outpost up on Pemaquid was supposedly there like around 1580, 1590. So keep in mind, 1530 is not that long after when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You know, it was sort of like, there were people that, and one story has it that Columbus consulted with Basque fishermen who had been sailing up in these regions before he sailed to the New World. So there'd been a Western European presence up here for a long time. So they had acquired access to these through the boat, small vessels. A shallop isn't big. It's a big sailboat, but it's a lot more capable, particularly for crossing water, than even a large birch bark canoe. And they were able to acquire these boats through their trading with the French. The schooners, I think, were sort of the exception. I don't think there were many of those. But you know, originally it was shallops, and then they graduated. They had some sloops and ketches.
Of course, Richmond Island was noted as a fishing station.
Fairly late in the game, though, for some reason. That one I want to hear. I don't recall the date, but that was long after, for example, Monhegan. Based on the availability of fish.
How much archaeology is going on now?
A lot more than they'll tell you about. So the Pentagon can't hold a candle to the Maine Commission on Historic Preservation, largely because there are a lot of people who have metal detectors and would just dearly love to go out and see what they could find about native sites. So there's ways you can figure it out, and there's things that slip out. There's things that slip out. Those are dig sites. At least the ones in boxes are. At least the ones along the rivers. And occasionally, if you know where to look, you can find out more information. So there are archaeologists in Maine. They have a journal. They do very, very fine work. They've got some major sites that they're doing. They've got lots of sites. If you have something like Portland Water District has got a pipe that's got to be dug up, it's in an interesting area, they're going to be on that in a heartbeat. But you don't, they tend to be a little bit reticent about the details because, they don't want to provide a shopping list for people that are then going to go out and desecrate the sites. And I don't blame them. We want to know the results, not the detail. I don't need to know an 8-digit grid coordinate for, where something specifically was.
Yeah, well, thank you, David,
Yeah,
very much.
thank you for your time.